This video is a complete restoration of my 1970 Kawasaki Bighorn, the F5 model, the first year. The original restoration took place in 2012 and first aired on Blip.tv exclusively on February 21st, 2013, with 13 episodes released thereafter 1 week apart. Here is the long play of the entire restoration done back at that time.
First, you gotta find the bike. But let's decide, what do you want to restore? Do you want to restore a vintage street bike, a vintage dirt bike, an evolution dirt bike, a modern dirt bike? What's your budget? How much can you afford? May that change what you can restore? What are your mechanical skills? What kind of tools do you have? How much space do you have? How much time do you have? Can you allocate sufficient time to the project? Will this be a multi-year project or only a few months? Will saving for money for parts delay the restoration? How about the condition of the bike? Are you willing to compromise condition for what you want? Do you want a basket case, a roller, a complete, or an all original? How about the parts? Are they available? Are they expensive? Are you going to have to use aftermarket parts? Can you even use aftermarket parts? These are all things that need to be considered before choosing a project. Sourcing the project, of course, there's the internet, Craigslist, eBay, and other online classifieds. Look at print ads, such as the newspaper, Cycle Trader, etc. Auctions, estate sales, dealer black lots, or good old picking, or alley shopping, as I like to call it. Here we are. We've located the bike and it's just around the corner. And here it is, the 1970 Kawasaki F5 350cc Bighorn. Now that we have this bike out, it's time to get the other two. Definitely don't want to come picking up bikes in your church clothes. Well, now that we have the bikes out of storage from the past 15 years, let's take a look at each one of them individually so I can assess which is the best candidate for restoration. Let's take a look at this first bike here. Obviously, we're missing a lot of body work here. Missing the head. We're missing some side covers and things, fenders and everything. Fortunately though, a good thing this one does have a carburetor here, and it looks like with some cleaning up this one will be salvageable. Put a carb kit in that. Exhaust here, the rims look pretty good. Wiring actually doesn't look hacked into, so that might be something that's definitely salvageable. So this bike could be salvaged, but the body parts are the big thing that is hard to get for these older bikes. Here's the second bike. As you can see, it's a little more complete, but because it's got a gas tank, we got a seat, or at least a seat pan. Foam would be have to be replaced here. We are Here's the clutch and primary cover. That's here. We got gear shifter. We got wheels are okay. The other side, this one also has a carburetor as well. But over here on the other side, we are missing a the whole clutch cover. Looks like it's been exposed to the elements, but it's not frozen. So I mean, this one would be maybe suitable or a better candidate. There's still a lot of parts going to have to source for this one, but it's a little bit better starting point for us here. And here's the third one. As you can see, it's a little more complete. We're not really missing any side covers. We're not missing the fenders. We got a tank. We got a seat pan. Still going to need a cover. Controls we'll need to replace, but those are a little easier to find than on the other bikes. The other thing is the instrumentation, which is gone off those other bikes. Headlight bucket. The wheels are in pretty good shape. This is the most complete bike, so this will probably be the one we'll use the basis for the basis of our restoration here, and the other ones will be parts bikes. However, looking it over on my stock here, with a few more parts and things, I could probably make 2 rideable bikes. Well, now it's time to load up the bikes. Remember to subscribe to me on YouTube, like my Facebook page, and check out the website for more updates on this project. I'm the Junk Man, and I'll see you back at the shop. Well, we're back again. After we learned a little bit of history about this bike, let's tear into it. Alright, now that we got the head off here, we can look down in the cylinder. Now this bike was stuck, and I had soaked it using some penetrating oil and even a little bit of diesel fuel, and let that soak for days and days. And then I drained it out and took the head off, and my piston is free now. So it'll move, of course, it'll move up and down. So we can take the head gaskets off, and interesting enough, somebody was using 2 head gaskets on this deal. My guess would be on this is a pretty high compression engine, and for those that know anything about 2-strokes here, you look at the head here, there should be at least a machine kind of flat area for a squish band, and that's to aid in the prevention of pre-ignition or detonation. These bikes were somewhat notorious for it, especially on poor quality fuel. So that's probably why somebody was using that. But using a good quality high octane fuel will keep that in check, as long as you use the correct heat range spark plug as well. So next I'm going to pull the cylinder off, and then we can work on cleaning up all these parts. Now you're probably wondering, why I'm tearing it down, why I'm not just stripping it, taking the engine out of the frame and all this. Well, what I like to do with all my restorations is I like to get them running first before I mess with any of the cosmetics of the engine, because basically if you don't do these steps now, you risk chipping or scratching any paint, or if you polish these cases up, you could
scuff them and fingerprint them up. You're just going to have to clean it up all later. And in this case, it's easier for me to use my harsh chemicals and everything before I have some of my finished products on here. Especially, I need to replace some gaskets and everything. So I'll kind of clean it up as I go. But I need to get the engine running. As you can tell from the other side, that the flywheel is missing, and the primary and ignition coils are kind of a little rusty, so I need to see if those will be workable and get the bike back in time. So first things first, I need to get this cylinder off and get it cleaned up so we can measure it and see what parts we need to put in this thing. We got the cylinder off finally. It was kind of stuck on there, which I anticipated. But looking at it, it looks in pretty good shape. I mean, some surface rusts and such that should hone out of there. Looking at the piston here, there's some scuffing on it and everything. This piston could, I don't know, maybe be shined up and could be used in an extreme case or an emergency case, but we're going to replace the piston rings, needle bearings, everything in there because this thing's been sitting for so long. We just need to at least do that. But before we know what we can buy, we have to clean this cylinder up and cylinder and head up, and we need to measure them so we know if this has been already bored over once or if it still can accept the standard size. We got our cylinder and head over here at the parts washer, got it off the bike. We need to clean it up here before we can start inspecting it, doing our honing operation, and then we can start our measurements to see which parts we need. Let's talk a little bit about safety. If you have a parts washer or you're thinking about getting one, always wear some type of gloves and eye protection as well. You're going to be splashing this stuff around. You don't want this stuff in your eyes, nor do you want it on your skin, because this stuff is pretty rancid, and it gets on your skin. It just doesn't come off, and it can burn, and some people can have severe allergic reactions. So you want to use some good quality gloves that will hold up to this type of solvent. Now let's get to cleaning. Well, I got our cylinder all cleaned up, and I soaked it overnight in a rust-removing solvent, which I'll give some more information at the end of this show. And after removing all the rust, I can now kind of loosely inspect the cylinder for any major ridges or wear. And actually, this bike, according to the odometer, only had a few thousand miles on it, and the cylinder looks pretty good. There's just a little bit of scuffing, which could be from using improper oil or just just age. And but it's not that bad. So the next operation I need to do, because it doesn't look like I need to have this cylinder bored. If there was some major scratches or a ridge at the top of where the piston comes to top dead center as far as up as the ring goes, I would need to have this bored, and then of course that'd make ordering parts really easy, because I can have the machine shop bore it to the correct size of the next oversized piston. But this doesn't need to be bored, but I do need to clean it up before we can do and take our measurements. So my next step I'm going to do here is get out my hones. Now, a little word about hones. Honing is a finishing operation. It can't take out major grooves, major imperfections. All honing does is put a good
crosshatch type finish, when done right, finish done on the bore, which helps retain oil as the engine is running, which is important in a two-stroke just as well as a four-stroke. Now, some of you might wonder, well, what type of hone, what grit, because there's all types of grits. Well, generally, when you're just doing a finishing job like I need to do here, you need to take a look at what kind of rings you're going to use. The manufacturer will typically give specifications on the type of grit you should use for the type of rings you're using. For example, if you're using just regular old iron rings in a plated cylinder, or moly rings, or chrome plated rings, not chrome moly rings, that's kind of a misnomer there. Or just really it depends on the ring manufacturer. But if you don't really know, the best recommendation is about a 240 grit. If there's heavy glazing, you may want to start with a 120 or even a 180 to break that glaze, and then finish up with a 240. And then depending on the rings, you may go as fine as 320 or even 400, depending on the type of finish which is required by these rings. Well, some of you out there might also be wondering, when you research your hones, you're going to see that there's different mineral types for the different honing stones. And the different minerals typically that you'll find is aluminum oxide and silicon carbide. The main difference is silicon carbide is a little harder mineral, meaning it's going to last a lot longer and give you a little bit finer finish. Aluminum oxide is kind of your baseline, cheap, run-of-the-mill abrasive. It's fairly soft, so meaning your stones are going to wear pretty quickly. Your cut rate's going to be less, and that's what you're going to find on most run-of-the-mill hones. And the more professional ones will use higher grade minerals, especially if it's a machine operation where they put the cylinder in a fixture and run the machine in and out of it to be professionally done. For the home shop, you're probably more familiar with this type. There's also the ball type, and there's a big debate on which one you should use, and it's usually comes down to personal preference. And the thing with ball hones is you have to order them by size. So if this is a one-time operation, you can spend like $60-$70 on one hone that you're going to use one time. If you're a racer and you do this a lot, it may behoove you to get that one for your specific bikes. But if you have a lot of different cylinder sizes, that's a lot of money in hones just for one operation. So most people will opt for this because it's adjustable down to a certain size, like 2-inch, and then this one goes up to, I believe, 7 inches. And this is what you're typically going to find in most auto parts or tool stores. And this will work just great for the home engine rebuilder. Professional builders will have a specialized machine where they can do this operation more precise. So honing is more an art, not a science when you're doing it this way. So there is some technique. So if you do have a spare cylinder around, you may or may not, you might want to practice on something first, or even use something like a PVC pipe, or just something to try and practice your technique. Because as you'll see here, there is a technique to doing this. Okay, I have my hone chucked up onto a variable speed drill, and the key here is to run the drill fairly slow and then use an in and out motion. So you're putting a crosshatch pattern for the rings to slide on and then the oil to retain on. Too steep a crosshatch pattern, the oil won't retain and it'll fall back down in the cylinder. Too shallow of an angle, and the rings could tear a little bit, or you'll get abnormal ring wear, or they may not seat correctly. Plus it may retain a little too much oil, and then it'll burn in the upper portion of the cylinder, which is more a problem on 4 strokes, but it is on 2 strokes as well, because the rings will not seat properly, and they can have a tendency to catch, especially during break-in. Alright, well, we're about ready to start our honing operation. And what you're going to see here is I'm going to start the drill and then start working it up and down to start putting my crosshatch pattern. And the lubricant I'm just using WD-40. There's a lot of different theories out there on what you could use or what you should use. There are honing oils, but most people will use WD-40. Works good because most people have it on the shelf. But you just need something to provide a little bit of lubrication and to keep the grit in suspension as you're doing this operation. Well, we just got done with her honing. Looks real good. We got a good crosshatch going in here. Well, I got to clean this up in some good warm soapy water, clean up the head, and we'll be ready to start measuring. So until next time, I'm the Junk Man, and thanks for watching. Oh, welcome back. If you remember, last episode, we honed and cleaned up our cylinder, so now we're ready to measure the cylinder to know which piston and rings to buy. But first, before we can do any measurements, one thing that you gotta have is a service manual. Now there's a couple different kinds out there. I prefer the factory issued service manuals. And the reason why I like these is because they deal with usually one particular model. So you're not thumbing through pages of information about other models that may be very similar but not the exact bike you're working on. The other type of manual would be the aftermarket, or the major publication that most people are familiar with is Climber. It's a publication, and their manuals are good. I have them and use them as well. Some of the downfalls to them is they do a broad range, specifically like with this bike. The factory service manual covers, well, it shows all the models it covers, but basically it just covers this one bike, the F5 Bighorn, and then some of the other variants like the 250cc model and whatnot. So basically when you read through this or you're looking for something, each page goes step by step through each system and you can follow along real easily. It reads like a book almost. Whereas something like a Climber, which is this particular model, spans Kawasaki's rotary valve engines from 80 to 350 cc's, 1966 through 1980. I mean, that's pretty broad range. And look at the thickness, they're about the same. So while this will have every single spec and measurement you need to do everything to the motorcycle, it may be a little confusing for some people who maybe are unfamiliar with the particular bike, because if you try to read this, you're actually skipping pages to get to the actual parts of the book that even talk about the model you're working on. However, the pro to this book, one of the things I do like about it is generally in the front of the book they have a lot of the general maintenance or specifications and adjustments in tables here for quick reference, a quick reference guide. That is a handy thing, whereas like your factory service manual won't do that, and typically my manuals I'll have notes written in the cover of all the pertinent specs, like say a spark plug type and the gap, something that I might use a lot and don't want to have to find the exact chapter where it tells me that. In the manual such as the Climbers, it's going to be right there on the 3rd, 4th, 5th page in, and you can find it real easily. So there's pros and cons to both manuals. Like I said, it's personal preference. Both manuals are going to allow you to do the same thing. The Climber is going to be easier to find than a factory service manual, especially for a 40-year-old bike like this. However, they are out there, and sometimes they are still available from the dealers. But this is my biggest pet peeve, is people won't spend the $30 for a service manual. They'll go traipsing around and just guessing at what certain specs should be. And some things, just like measuring the cylinder,
it will be impossible to know if this cylinder is within spec or not without a service manual. Let's talk about tools for a little bit here. First one, the main thing you're going to need after your service manual is a pen and paper, because you're going to need this to write down your measurements. Second tool that is required for this is some type of caliper. This one is in standard inches and has a dial indicator. Just zero it out. I have it set up for the specification we need. There also is the other type of electronic caliper that is digital. Turn it on here, and when you move it, the numbers move and gives you a pretty accurate. Either one will work. For some things, I prefer an analog readout such as this, and other times when I just need a quick one, I like this too. Sometimes these electronic calipers can be kind of touchy, and so sometimes when you need to see the movement, fine movement, sometimes an analog gauge is a lot easier to use. The other thing, and the most important thing actually for measuring a cylinder bore, is you need a set of cylinder bore depth gauges that can reach down in the cylinder and measure cylindrical devices. This happens to be the one that we're going to use because this one will adjust for the size of cylinder we have. Okay, I got everything laid out here, everything I'm going to need to measure this cylinder bore. Got my pen and paper, I got my calipers here, I got it set to the specification according to the the service manual. I have my bore gauge here. As you can see, it's spring loaded, and when you tighten that little set screw up, it holds it in place, and then we can put it in between the calipers and measure the actual bore size. If you follow the manual, it'll tell you exactly how and where to measure, but the idea is to take a measurement like this, measurement like this, and do it in various points down into the cylinder to measure the cylinder's taper as well as how round it is. And in this case, the specifications here are if a measurement between each 2 points exceeds either 0.02 or 0.05 millimeters, the cylinder needs to be rebored and squared. And if any measurement exceeds 0.006 or 0.15 millimeters, the whole cylinder needs to be replaced because it's outside of the tolerance of being able to bore, according to our service manual. So let's get started. Well, we got all our measurements taken, and we wrote them down on our piece of paper here. And looking at them, they're actually all pretty consistent. We have a pretty consistent bore. It does taper just slightly towards the bottom of the cylinder, but that's to be expected. There is actually a taper built into this. And according to our charts in the manual, we're right on with spec, as in we don't need to bore this. It's pretty much round. There was very little variance. The most variance I had was about 0.03 millimeters between a distance, and that was the lowermost point there. So what we determined is that this cylinder is suitable for reuse. We don't have to bore it. Our honing job kept everything nice and round and square, and it knocked off all the high and low spots, and we have a nice crosshatch for a good ring seal. Another thing that's worth noting is also we need to check the top of the cylinder and the head for flatness. And to do that, you just need a good straight edge. I happen to have a combination square here, and you want to check it in a couple different places. And what you're looking for is if you can feel any rocking motion. Now, if you do, you need to get out your feeler gauge, and in the manual it'll have a certain specification for how true it is. But feeling it here, checking it a couple different ways, I don't feel any rocking. So that means there's no hump, or it's not warped over time. So that means the cylinder has not been overheated, and so we can be confident that we'll have a good head gasket seal. We also need to check the head the same way. If anything, the head may warp more than the top of the cylinder, but it still goes that we need to check. And like I said, you can do this with any straight edge you have around. It just needs to be an accurate straight edge. And I don't feel any rocking, so our cylinder heads and cylinder do not need to be milled or surfaced in any way to make a proper seal. Well, now that we know that everything's true and our cylinder is within spec and does not require boring, now we know what size piston. We can order a standard size piston and ring, and we're also going to order a new wrist pin and small end bearing, as well as a complete gasket kit. So it's off to the internet to find ourselves some parts. And in the meantime, we can start tearing down some more of the bike. Here we go. We got our piston pin pulling tool to get the piston off. Next thing we're going to do here, we got our piston off, is we're going to start measuring the big end of the connecting rod's side plate. And you'll need a good set of feeler gauges for this. I have my feeler gauge here set for the maximum allowable tolerance for this measurement. And what we want to do is hold the rod end to one side of the crank and try and stick our feeler gauge in. And as you can see, it doesn't fit. I can't push it in there. So that means that we're not worn past the service limit. Okay, I've adjusted my feeler gauge to the minimum adjustment or amount of clearance that there needs to be in here. We do the same thing, hold it to the right side, and well, we can stick it in there, but there's a little bit of drag, meaning this engine, of course, is properly broken in. Well, it should be. It has about 5,000 miles on it. With a good feel, our adjustment or our specification here is actually halfway between the minimum service and the maximum service limit. So we're right on the money. We don't necessarily need to replace these thrust washers here. That's what we're measuring for, because they wear over time. Also, the other thing to check is the big end play, and if you do it easy, I can't feel any up and I'm trying to move the rod up and down and I can't. I mean, I can move it side to side. There should always be some side to side movement. Now that's what your feeler gauge is for, is to make sure you don't have too much. Too little, and it can score the bearings or get too hot in here. And that's something that an engine builder, when they rebuild the crank, will set up for you, or they should set up for you. But we wanted to see if we need to rebuild this crank, and I'm determining the big end bearing is suitable for reuse in this case. The other adjustment we want to look at here is feeling for any crankshaft bearing play. And I'm trying to move the crank up and down, and I don't feel any. And same with in and out for the thrust, and I don't feel any there. So I've determined that I probably don't need to replace the bearings. However, most people probably would. In this case, for this restoration, the engine is in pretty good shape. It wasn't neglected like most. However, if I did see a lot more scuffing on the piston, or this adjustment or measurement was out of the service limit, or things like the wrist pin that we just pulled out, if it was badly worn, I would probably rebuild this crank. But given this bike, we're just doing a restoration, mostly as a show bike. I mean, I'll ride it a little bit, but we're not going to put this engine through competition. This engine is suitable. We're going to put a top end in it and finish cleaning it up, and we're going to be good to go. Well, that's about it for this episode. I'm the Junk Man, and next time we'll work on putting the top end in, and then we'll move on to the next step. Got it. Well, welcome back. As you can see, we progressed a little bit farther on our build since last time. We've taken the clutch cover off and taken the engine, disassembled it a little bit to check for any major problems, rust, or damage. And from it being sitting, it would not be uncommon to maybe find some water in here and a lot of rust, and we don't. The engine looks really good. So now we're ready to start putting our stuff back together. And we got to start with putting the top end on. But before we can do any type of assembly, we have to set our ring gap. An often overlooked step is setting the ring gap, making sure we have the correct gap when the rings are installed into the cylinder. To do this, you'll need to get out your trusty feeler gauge here, and of course you'll have to have your new piston rings. And something kind of unique about this engine, we'll stop here a little bit, is this has 3 different piston rings. This is very unusual for a 2-stroke. It's common on a 4-stroke, but very unusual for a 2-stroke. The manual states the reason why the F5 350 Bighorn has 3 rings is the 3rd ring is to aid in cooling the cylinder and piston. Now honestly, I don't know what that means. It just seems like it'd be extra friction, because, and Kawasaki must have known that, because in the optional power-up kit that was offered during that year was a optional lighter 2-ring piston that helped this engine achieve the claimed 45 horsepower that everybody wanted out of this engine. Anyway, we need to take our rings and we're going to measure them one by one. Following our service manual, you install it into the system, into the cylinder, approximately 5 millimeter down. We use the piston to just make sure it's squared up there. And I have my feeler gauges set out, my minimum gap,
And that's real important. We don't want the gap to be too tight or the rings won't seat properly. And that fits in there pretty good. I don't feel any resistance. So let's go to the next size. I feel just a teeny bit, but still slides in and out of there pretty easy. So let's get to our next size larger here. And we'll see how good we are. You know, I can just barely feel some drag on that gap there. So that particular measurement is right in between the minimum and maximum amount of ring gap that is allowed before we have to replace the rings. In this case, it should be right in there because if you remember in the last episode, we measured our cylinder and we determined that it was in spec, so the new rings should be in spec. However, should the ring gap be too tight, you need to take a file, and you're not going to be taking too much material, but file in between. You'll hold them together and file in between to get the correct gap. And this will happen sometimes, especially on brand new cylinders. The gap can be actually a little on the tight side. But the big thing is you don't want your rings to have too loose of a gap, or then you'll lose compression on your freshly built motor. So next ring up, and we'll be finished with this job. Well, now that we have our ring gaps checked and set for this cylinder, we can go ahead and now start assembling our piston. Okay, we're ready to start assembling our piston. Now, different engines come with different types of rings. These are regular old iron rings that are plated on the ends. That's why they're kind of shiny. It's hard to see in the camera here. One other thing that sometimes comes with your piston kit is these little funny looking, they're almost wiry and they're kind of octagonal, or you know, they're kind of wavy, I guess is the best way to describe these. And a lot of people don't know what these are, and a lot of people just trash them. And in some situations, that's the correct thing to do. Some engines actually don't need them or run better without them. Your service manual will tell you. What these are called are expander rings. And obviously in a 2-ring piston, you're only going to have one of these, and they're always installed on the lowermost ring. In this case, since we have 3 piston rings, these 2 go in the lowermost. What they do is basically they act as an extra spring to put more tension on the rings as they're in the cylinder to help ring seal. And with this high open compression of engine, this is pretty high for especially 1970, they used 2 of these to help achieve the correct ring sealing. So they go on pretty simply. They just slide on, and you put them into the groove that they go in, and you want to make sure the gap is then located. If you look closely at your piston, there will be little pins that are where the piston gap should go. And also you want to note where their position in the piston, whether they're centered or whether they're on the upper or the lower portion, because that will make a difference on how you install the rings. Alright, with our expander rings installed, it's time to start installing the piston rings. Now, like I said, you want to note the orientation of the little piston pins that keep the rings from spinning, and look at your rings real closely, and you should notice how the gap is. If the pins are centered, it will be 2 little half moons. In this case, the pins are on the upper portion of the ring groove, so there's chamfers that correspond to that. And a lot of times the rings will be labeled, will have a punch mark. In this case, they have a T for top, which corresponds to this side goes up and then that way the rings will be installed correctly. Another handy tool, which is not required but makes installing piston rings a lot easier, is a ring expander. You stick both the ends of the rings in here, and you can open them up and put them over the ring, or the piston rather. And you can do it with your thumbs, and a lot of people do it this way, but they can really poke and dig into your thumb, especially really thick rings like these are. That's why this tool really makes it a lot easier, and it's a less chance of actually breaking the ring in the process. Piston rings are made of real ductile iron, which means that they're very brittle when certain strains, especially if you try to twist them, they could snap really easy. And we'll install our second ring. And when you're doing this, you only want to expand them as much as needed to get them around the piston, and then just make sure they get seated, make sure that they're aligned with the pins. And you'll notice the bottom one pin is over here, the middle one's over here, and then the top one's back over here. They're staggered, so there's less chance of compression loss. And there we have it, a fully loaded piston. Now another good thing to do is to get your feeler gauge out and check for the gap in the ring lands, and there's a certain spec to do that. You just stick your feeler gauge in there and measure the gap. Well, before I'm going to put the top end on, I need to put this side cover back on. That's why, along with some of the parts I got a brand new gasket kit. What I'm doing here is just adding just a teeny bit of gasket adhesive. This will help position the gasket and keep it lined up with all the bolt holes. There is one locating dowel pin, but the rest of these, there's no way to keep the gasket from slipping around. So just a touch, not too much, just a touch of gasket adhesive so we can stick this on, let it set for a little bit, and then we can slide our clutch cover on. Well, we're ready to install our piston onto our rod. I've already pre-lubed everything. I have the needle bearing in the little end of the rod, and I also had the piston pin in the freezer to aid in installing it, and it should just slide right in. Alright, I got the pin through here, and I'm just using my installer tool to just pull the pin through a little bit to get it just past the grooves where the little circlips will go, and that's what I can install next. Well, now that we got our piston installed, we're ready to put the cylinder on. First, I got a little cup full of my 2-stroke oil. I'm going to wipe that all over the cylinder, all over the piston and rings to keep them from galling. I have my cylinder base gasket set down on there, and I made sure I installed my piston with the arrow pointing the exhaust port per the instructions, and we're ready to put this on. Little tip when you're installing the cylinder, there is a specialized tool, a ring compressor, that you can put on that compresses the rings, but most people will compress the rings and slide the cylinder over just by using their hands. And usually, because the cylinder's kind of got a taper to it, usually you can do it this way. But if you can't get it and your rings are catching, then you're going to have to buy the tool. The other thing is make sure your ring gaps are lined up with the little pins on the piston. You don't want them in any other position. Otherwise, obviously, the rings are just going to tear out the first time you kick it over. Well, we're ready to put our head on. I got my head gaskets on here, and actually the kit came with one head gasket, and I'm going to reuse 2 of them that came with it, because it actually had 3, and mostly because these engines are notorious for detonation because the head does not have a proper squish band. So this is probably something I'm going to have to adjust. I may send the head off to have it machined, but for now I'm going to install on the 3 head gaskets just to lower the compression a little bit for easier of starting and easier of break-in until I get around to tuning this engine, and then I can figure out which head gaskets sets work the best. So I have them set on here, set my head on, and I've installed a bit of thread lubricant on my head bolts so I can get an accurate torque. Well, the last thing we got to do is torque all our head bolts. I have my torque wrench set to the proper spec, and we'll go in a crisscross manner. So until next time, I'm the Junk Man. Like me on Facebook, check out the website, and thanks for watching. Well, welcome back. And now it's on to the subject that everybody loves to talk about, the carburetor. Incidentally, my carburetor diagnosis and disassembly video and my idle speed mixture adjustment video is some of my highest viewed and highest rated videos. And I can only attribute that to people just are baffled by this thing. And here's another one off of this bike that we're working on. You know, it's got some unique qualities to it as far as how it's designed, but overall it functions exactly the same as any other carburetor out there. Alright, we got the bowl off our carburetor. We're going to clean it up, disassemble it and clean it up and everything. I'm not going to go into too much detail on actually how to do this because I have other videos that explain this and explain the theory of the carburetor and its operation. So you can go over and find those on my show. But I will point out some somewhat unique things about this carburetor and its design. Like I said, it functions exactly the same as every other carburetor out there. It's just the design is a little bit different compared to what you're mostly used to. Okay, just to show you some unique design features on this carburetor that are a little more unique is you'll notice that the two floats ride on little pins that are in the carburetor bowl. Now typically, and if you watch my other videos, you'll see that the floats actually ride and are attached on the arm. In this case, the carburetor float arm is operated by two little pins that are on the floats here, you can see, and it rides right on them. Another unique portion of the thing that makes this carburetor unique is actually how the main jet circuit operates. Because this is a rotary valve engine and this carburetor sits behind a cover and it's enclosed in the engine cases basically. There's a plug on the outside cover that you take that off, and then to access the main jet is by this unique style of banjo bolt. And there it is. There's your main jet on the end of this banjo bolt that has holes in the end here. How it works is, if you look down in here, there's one big hole right down there, and the fuel enters there, then goes into this chamber, then into this depressed portion in the casting, which then is sealed by this O-ring, and then this is where the jet needle fits down into, and the jet controls how much fuel is allowed to flow into this portion and thusly up into the portion of where the jet needle rides. And another interesting kind of feature of this carburetor, because it's in a sealed compartment within the engine and not externally like outside, all the vent hoses have to be interconnected, and then they run out and through a grommet in the case, which you'll see later when we get back to the engine and assembling the engine back into the frame and hooking up the fuel lines, and also there's a vacuum line that operates the fuel shutoff, and more on that later. This carburetor also features an air screw. This is the intake bell, or the portion that if the air filter clamped on here, this would be the air filter side, and you can see there's a screw right here. This is an air screw, so not a fuel screw. Fuel screws are typically found under here or on this side of the carburetor. This side goes directly towards the engine. Well, that's all the further I'm going to go in explaining how this carburetor operates. I'm going to get to disassembling it, cleaning it up, and verifying the specifications per the service manual. And then we'll be ready to start installing the engine into the frame and try to start this thing. We got the engine temporarily mounted back in the frame so we could hook it up to the wiring harness, coil, and CDI box, and we're here for the moment of truth, ready to hook it up and see if we have spark. Well, success! We have spark, so that means all of our ignition components are working as they should be.
And to be honest, I'm pretty confident in my abilities, but this is the one thing that I was really worried about with this bike, because these ignition components are, of course, obsolete and then very hard to find in working order used in the aftermarket like eBay or junkyards. And if these didn't work, I was really going to have to figure out an alternate solution. But success, we have ignition. Well, just a moment ago, you saw that we had spark. When we put the engine back in, hooked up all the electronics and everything. I got the carburetor back together. It's all clean. It's set to the factory specifications per the service manual. I hooked up an auxiliary tank and an auxiliary oil tank, because this is oil injected, so I can attempt to start the bike. Well, I tried starting the bike. I wasn't rolling the camera. I ran it for a few minutes, shut it down with the key, started it up, ran it for a couple minutes, shut it down with the key, started it up, ran it for a few more minutes, just kind of doing a light heat cycling to break the engine in. And I went to start it up for a fourth time to then fully heat the engine up and see how our tuning was. And by the way, it ran really good, but now I don't have spark. So this is something that happens along the way with restorations, and it even happens to us, the so-called pros or experts. And I don't claim to be too much of an expert, but I got some diagnosing to do. So actually, this is probably a good thing, because I get to show you maybe the ins and outs of how the electronics works and how to go about diagnosing an ignition problem. Well, over here on the other side of the bike, as you can see, I had it all hooked up so I could try and start it. And after I primed the carburetor, it started up second, third kick after it got some fuel into the cylinder. Ran great. But now we don't have spark, which I suspect, because of the age of the bike, that maybe my exciter and signal coils on the magneto are faulty or became faulty, or they were kind of just within spec enough to give me spark and it to run, and then run long enough to vibrate some rust or some corrosion loose, and now I either have a dead short or an open short. I don't know, but we're going to diagnose this. And this is the part of the restoration and repair that I told you a few episodes back that, before you start on anything, you need the service manual. And this is one time where it doesn't matter if this was a modern bike, old bike, whatever. You got to have the service manual, because you wouldn't know how to check it or know what the specs are. I mean, you may know how to check it just from general knowledge, but you won't know if it's in or out of spec, because you won't know the specs, I guarantee it. And for certain bikes and things, you may not be able to find it on the internet, so you're resorting to forums to try to obtain this information. So let's get started. Okay, I got everything set up here. I got my service manual open to the page that tells me how to test the windings on the magneto. Also has a table tells me the ohm readings. Now you're going to need one of these, a volt ohm meter. These can be gotten anywhere. They can be had for as little as $5. They're kind of a get what you pay for. The more expensive ones obviously are going to be a little more durable, a little more accurate, whatnot. But for these kind of tests, even the $5 ones are going to be suitable. Alright, per my manual, I'm going to test each one of the wires and write down what the specifications I get on my readout here, and then compare them to what the book is supposed to be, and then I can determine if that's the problem, and if that's not, then we need to move on to other parts of the ignition system. Alright, well, I've taken all my readings. I wrote them down on what the limits are per the manual and what each test gave me, and here's the readings here. And it looks like they're a little off. The exciter coil was 147 ohms.
It should be around 220. These are all plus or minus 10% per the manual. Signal coil is 36 ohms. It should be 75. Charging coil is 0.7. It should be 0.23. Lighting coil, same thing, 0.7, should be 0.23. Now, the charging and the lighting coils, I'm not too concerned about it at this point because I'm not really concerned about getting the lights working. And actually, those aren't too far off, so the lighting coil might be, usable for this application. And actually, if I was converting this to make it a vintage motocross bike, I would probably just eliminate those coils anyways because I wouldn't be using the lights anyways. But anyway, it kind of looks like this is probably our culprit. Probably what happened, like I said before, is some corrosion, rust, or whatnot, some degradation of the wiring and the windings in the coils. That's probably what caused this. And what this tells me is, since the ohm readings are going down, it means I'm having more of a dead short. I don't have a dead short because 0 ohms would mean I have a dead short, meaning it's grounded. An open short, I would have infinity ohms, or it wouldn't even read on my scale. So that's kind of how I determined where to go with this. So I have the tough task of finding replacement parts. Now I do have 3 other bikes that I can rob from, so I'm going to do these same tests on the 2 other components that I have, 2 other bikes, and see if they're any better. And if they're within spec, I'm going to have to swap parts. Now here's the bike that I took the flywheel off because that one was missing it. And just to explain here, this side, this coil, this big one, this is the lighting and charging coil. Over here is what the ignition works off of. This smaller one here, this outside one, that's your signal coil. Think of it like the contact breakers on a breaker point. This is what is creating a small amount of voltage that then goes to the CDI box and tells it when to fire. The other one is the exciter coil, and this is what creates the voltage that then is sent to the coil to be stepped up to then fire the spark plug. So in my test, it's showing that both of these are out of spec, and I'm hoping that these are in better shape, or have aged better, should I say, than the other ones. Now, I will say, if you saw the first episode, or the first and second episode of this, that bike there, the cover and flywheel was missing, so they'd been exposed to the elements for God knows how long, where this was actually behind a cover, magneto in there, so this was not exposed to the elements, so I'm going to hope that these are in better condition. If these aren't, I have one more chance because I have one more bike to try and get parts off of. Otherwise, I'm going to have to find some new old stock parts out on the internet or from a junkyard bike and hope that they're better than what I have. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this episode. I got some work to do diagnosing and replacing these parts, but in the meantime, we're going to finish stripping the bike, we're going to work on the suspension, and we're going to start stripping the frame so we can clean it up, get the body work started, and then we can finally start putting things back together, maybe for the last time. So until next time, I'm the Junk Man. Like my Facebook page, check out my website, and subscribe to this show. you can see, we got the bike running. After doing some testing and swapping some ignition parts, we got it running. Runs real good. Probably needs some tuning once I put this bike back together for the last time and just tweak the carburetor. And but otherwise, it sounds real good. Runs real good. And now we can start tearing apart the bodywork, getting the frame stripped down so we can prep it and get ready for paint. And then we can start putting this thing back together. Well, alright, we're ready to get to the suspension. These fork seals are old and they're leaking, and we're going to change them. Alright, the first thing you need to do is, before you actually take the forks out of the top clamps, you need to loosen up these top fork caps. On newer bikes, they're a lot bigger. These older bikes are a lot smaller. But the important thing is you want to get the appropriate size wrench. A lot of companies make the special wrenches for them. You can use a standard open end and such, or socket, just as long as it's the correct size. Do not use like an adjustable wrench, like a Crescent brand wrench on these, because you will round the corners off. Now this bike is pretty old. I've already tried using my wrenches and I can't get them broke loose. Also, you got spring tension against these just a little bit. That's why I have the frame up on a block, so there's no weight on it, but still there's a little bit of preload in here. Plus these forks have the adjustable preload down in here, and more about that later. But these ones are probably kind of corroded and just need a little bit of breaking loose. Now I do not necessarily recommend this in all situations, but and only as a last resort. I'm going to use my impact and just blip it every so slightly. The hammering action should just break them loose, and then I ought to be able to just twist them out. Yep, and that's it. That's all it took. But like I said, this is definitely a last resort. Alright, over on the bench here, I can finish taking off the top cap. And as I unscrew it, you want to be careful, because once it gets close to the end, it's going to kind of want to pop out of there. And because there's a spring back here, and also usually a little washer or maybe even a spacer, depending on the type of forks you have. And I'm going to show you something neat about these once this becomes... See, it kind of popped out of there. Alright. And these forks here have had little drain screws here, so I could actually drain most of the oil out. Most forks won't have this, most modern forks, so your spring and your oil is going to want to dump out when you tip it out here. But now that we've got the pieces out, I can tell you a little bit more about them. Okay, obviously here's our spring, which is actually attached to our damper rod, which we'll get to next.
But here's what makes these forks a little bit different and unique. Now, all forks are going to have probably a washer or a spacer that rides up on top of the spring, and then that presses somewhere on the top cap. But if you look at this, notice this is stepped in a way, and behind this plug is, what you'll notice, is a slotted, like a flathead screw. And what's that for is so you can twist this and see as this piston rises up. You got 3 positions here. And what it does is it rides on this, which then pushes on the spring, and this is screwed into the cap, which changes the preload of the spring. And looking here, you know, you have almost an inch worth of preload of adjustability here in 3 positions. Now this is very unique, especially for a bike this old or in 1970, and especially for Japanese bikes, is forks not being adjustable at all. About all you could do was change the weight of the oil, or go to an aftermarket spring, which required disassembling the fork a little bit to do. Where this is an adjustment of the screwdriver, and you can set your preload. Okay, we're at the other end of the fork here, and we need to take out the bolt that attaches to the damper rod. The damper rod is what holds the 2 halves of the suspension together, so the inner tube does not fall out of the outer tube. And it's held in usually with a bolt that has an Allen head bolt, and usually it shouldn't be too tight. Okay, got the bolt that holds the damper rod in, and now we can separate the 2 halves of the fork. Okay, if we did everything right, the 2 halves should just separate real easy. And there we go. Here's our damper rod. It's held in there by a little circlip, and then there's a bushing in there, and actually this hole in here, that's part of your what's called your valving. Oil flows through there as well as in here, and we can now take the spring out. We can do some measurements on that, see if it's collapsed. As you can see, this is a progressive rate spring. It's got narrower coils here than it does here, and so you kind of want to remember which way this came in or out, so you might want to label this for reassembly later. Okay, now for those who may not be familiar, a lot of people think this is the seal because this is all they see. Well, no, this is just the dust protector, and this is pretty old and brittle, and I'm probably going to ruin it taking it off here. But all you need to do is take a screwdriver, and you want to just be very careful, and you'll just pry it off a lip here, and sometimes you can do it with your fingers. I can see this, it's cracking a little. So I'm going to have to source new parts for this, which same with fork seals, because that's why we're doing this job. But it just comes off here like that, and yeah, that's pretty toasted. I'm not going to use that again. And of course, because this was leaking, there's a bunch of crap and crud in here. So you want to take a little screwdriver and work it around here, clean it all out, because there's a little snap ring, and there's the end of it here, and we'll take that out, and then you can the actual fork seal that seals the oil is right in here. And I can feel and even look at this. This is pretty well wore out, which that's to be expected with a bike like this. But really, even on modern forks, this is basically all there is to it, to disassembling a fork for purpose of replacing, say, the wiper or the fork seals if they're leaking really bad. You know, the only thing is, on a modern fork, you're not going to have little drain holes at the bottom. This was something that was common years and years ago. I kind of wish they'd leave them on bikes today, because then it makes it easy to change fork oil and such. But I suppose it's a failure point. You know, when you're out riding, you could hit a rock and knock one of those off and drain all your fork oil out. So there's pros and cons to it. But anyway, that's basically all there is taking apart a conventional fork like this. but inverted forks are very similar. But the main thing is read your manual. It'll tell you exactly how to do all this, especially with the inverted forks. You may have to have a special tool to hold this damper rod to be able to take this bolt out, because this is up in there, and if it's stuck, and it's just going to want to spin. Which another tip that I didn't say is you can actually, with the spring in there, put the top cap back on. Sometimes puts enough pressure on the damper rod to hold it to break this loose. But usually on modern forks, these aren't stuck in there. So, and I got lucky on this one that this one wasn't all corroded and stuck in there, which probably the reason why is because this bike was actually inside and not getting rained on year after year after year. So now we got to get our new, clean up everything, get our new parts, and we can reassemble this the exact way it went back together. Well, I hope you learned a little something about how to take apart a conventional fork on a motorcycle. As you can see, it's not too complicated. Read your manual, and it's pretty easy. I gotta go out, source some new fork seals and wipers before I can put this back together. So, until next time, I'm the Junk Man. Like my Facebook page, check out my website, and subscribe to this show. Well, welcome back. We have all our parts cleaned up, and we have our fork legs refinished and painted up just like the factory, and we're ready to put everything back together. Okay, we're ready to install our seals. And to do this, you can do this a couple different ways. Here's my seal. I'm going to use a bearing and seal driver here that is the appropriate size. You want it to be just slightly smaller than the seal you're going to install down into the leg. If you don't have this tool, you can use something like a socket. Choose one that is, like I said, slightly smaller than your seal, because you're going to have to hammer it down in there. And then, of course, you can't hammer in this open part, so you're going to have to get like a block of wood or a piece of metal to be able to hammer on. But this is a good way to improvise if you do not have a seal driver that has this flat edge here. Okay, another thing before you get to installing your seals, is you want to make sure you install them in the correct orientation. You'll see on one side there's a little spring and a lip. Now, if you paid attention on how these came out, this should always go down into the fork. Also, another thing is you want to make sure you have everything cleaned out of the center before you do this, because if you need to still wash them out, you're going to potentially contaminate your new seal when you do this, if you don't do that beforehand. So most seals you can kind of press in there, get them started, and I, to protect my legs, I'm on a block of wood with a rag on top to protect the finish that I just applied to these. And then you want to put your seal driver on top there, and then take your hammer and just lightly, they should go pretty easy, but this, using the seal driver, ensures that you will install them flush and square into the fork tube and just drive them home. Okay, your next steps is as simple as just putting everything back the way it came out. In this case, there's a little retaining washer, and then our little snap ring that fits into a groove there, and that went in pretty easy. Sometimes you might have to get a screwdriver to help press it in there, and that's just to help hold the seal in. I mean, it's pressed in there, but this just helps hold the seal in. Okay, now we're ready to install the fork legs into the sliders. And what I like to do first is I'll take a little bit of oil, a little bit of fork oil and just you know, coat the lip of the seal. This is just aid in letting the upper fork tube with the slider slip past the seal more easily and prevent it from tearing out. Even though you may see the end is tapered, it can still catch and be a little sharp. Now, suspension shops there's protectors called like seal bullets is what they call them. And if you're doing a lot of them, you might want to invest in them, take them apart. That'll keep you from damaging new seals and such when you're installing them. But when you're just going to be doing it basically for the first time, or one time, it's not really necessary. So just slide it together, maybe do a little twisting action until it bottoms out. And I have the spring in here because that'll push on the damper rod, because as you remember, there's a little bolt that goes into the bottom of the leg, and then that's what holds the damper rod and the slider from coming out of the end of the fork leg. Well, we have everything put back together. I have the drain screws back in the bottom of the fork legs. I have some fork oil here measured up, ready to put in and fill it up. You'll get the spec for how much should go in out of your service manual. Most service manuals will give a quantity, or it may give a measurement where you use a fork level gauge, and I'll show you that a little bit later. But this is telling me we use 175 cc's of oil per leg. And you want to be as accurate as you can. And as far as oil or lubricant, just use any quality fork oil. The weight you should use is totally dependent on you, but there are some recommendations in the service manual. Actually, this bike recommended mixing different weights of motor oil. Back in the day, there weren't always specialized fork oils. You could even use automatic transmission fluid in these, was another recommended lubricant. But I'm going to use a quality 5-weight fork oil. Well, now all we have to do is put the fork caps back on. And sometimes this is easier done with the forks in the triple clamps, because you have to push against the spring to get them started. Well, we got both forks filled up with oil here, and I wanted to show you the other tool that can make this job easier, or some forks, this is how you set the oil level. It's used with this tool. It's basically a syringe with a long tube, and then it has an adjustable stop here. And you have to read your service manual to get the spec, but you set this depth of this tube to a certain depth with the forks collapsed, springs out. Fill your forks up with oil, almost all the way full or most of the way. You stick this down on to the top of the fork leg and then suck out the oil until obviously it won't suck anymore, because the level has gotten to the end of the tube here, and that sets your fork oil level. Now this is very common in upside down or inverted forks, but read your service manual. It tells you how to do this. When you buy the tool, it also comes with an instruction manual that tells you how to do this, but the specification that you set this to will be found only in the service manual, because it'll vary by different types of fork size and manufacturers. Well, that's it. As you can see, with really no special tools outside of this, depending on the type of forks you have, changing fork seals, changing the fork oil is actually a pretty straightforward process, no matter what type of forks you have. So until next time, I'm the Junk Man. Like my Facebook page, and thanks for watching. Welcome back. We're ready to get down to the details because we're nearing the home stretch. And I have a couple things laid out here, and I'm going to show you how to refinish a couple of pieces and take care of some common problems that you'll find on a bike that you're restoring. First off here, I've already refinished it, but here's the exhaust. I stripped it. I put a couple good coats of some high quality, high temp rust inhibiting primer, and then some good coats of some high temp gloss black paint, because this is designed to be a gloss black muffler. There's also a trim piece that will go on here, and I'll shine that up later. Next thing I have on the table here is the skid plate, and as you can see, it's pretty beat up. It's hit some rocks in its day and pretty scratched up. So we're going to have to put this back into shape. I mean, obviously, if it's easy to just buy a new one, that'd be the best route. On this bike here, there is no more new old stocks that are easy to find. I mean, they do come up once in a while on eBay, and I could go that route, but I'm going to try to salvage this one because even though it's beat up, I think I can fix it. I have two other bikes here, but they're in no better condition. Next thing here is we have an ignition cover here, and I'll show you a little bit more, but we have a couple of little gouges and things in here that we got to take care of. And same with the carburetor cover. This is a rotary valve engine, so this is the carburetor cover. And there's a few scratches and a little ding here that we're going to show you how to fix. As I bring it in closer here, I'll show you exactly what we got. Here's a little closer up shot of the skid plate here, and of course you can see it's kind of beat up. We're going to take care of that. And this ignition cover, I've already done a little bit of prep work on this. As you can see, there's some light gouges in here, and what I did is I took, in this case, I experimented and took some 80 grit sandpaper, and just to knock down the rough spots and the high spots where, you know, this bike fell over and hit a rock or something like that, or a stick came up. These old bikes, these aluminum side covers, they're cast, and they're kind of a cheap casting. They're easy to break or gouge. I shouldn't say they're easy to break. They're just real soft, so they're easy to damage. And so what I've done is taken some 80 grit sandpaper and just knocked down the high spots here. And these gouges are very minor. They're not very deep. Really, the worst is maybe a 1/16 of an inch deep. So these will, we're going to spray and fill these with some high build primer, and do some sanding steps in between, and make this thing come out all nice and smooth. Now, this is designed to be painted. The original finish is a painted look, as you can tell. Compare it next to the carburetor cover. I mean, obviously there's normal wear and tear. It's worn off on the edges here. That's normal. And here, wear your boot. Sometimes rubs, but you know, if this was something on a bike that needed to be polished, it'd be almost impossible probably to save this because of these gouges. But because it's going to be painted, we can actually hide that with filling it with some high build primer. Looking closer at our carburetor cover, as you can see, the original painted finish is worn and scratched. And these light scratches we're going to be able to take out with our 80 grit sandpaper, just to knock these down. Maybe we'll go back with maybe 120 or something. See, it's going to be an experiment to see how this might work. Wipe some of that sanding dust off, and if I feel across that, just that little bit I did there, kind of just smoothed it up. So we'll be able to use a high build primer to fill those. But this part is the part that I'm going to experiment with a technique that I just kind of thought of. Is a lot of off-road guys have probably seen this stuff. It's from MSR. It's called Quick Aluminum. They also have Quick Steel, and what it is it's a stick of basically like a paste. It's a two-part. As you can see, there's a black, an A and a B, a silver, and then the black part's the B. You break off or cut off whatever you need, knead it till it's uniform color, and then you can patch, you know, broken case and then get you down along the trail or get you back to your pickup. Well, what I'm going to try and do, and I don't know if this is going to work honestly, but I'm going to do the same thing and use it like a body filler. Now, because this is an engine cover, and even though this is the carburetor cover, it's not going to get real hot because it's isolated away from the main heat of the engine. It is going to get warm, and I don't know if, say, a standard, body filler could stand to the temperature. So I'm going to try this technique, and what we're going to do is we're going to mix up and daub it on here and try to mimic as best we can before this hardens this shape here. And then afterwards, we can probably, this is lightly sandable, we can take some sandpaper and maybe form it. And then once we hit it with some primer and paint, hopefully you'll never even know that it was damaged. Now, a lot of people would say, well, you got 3 other bikes, don't you have a replacement cover? And yes, I do. However, this bike is one of the early models by the frame number and by the engine number. Actually, the build date was February of 1970, so this is one of the early ones, and this is slightly different from the other later models, even the later 1970 models. So this is actually a pretty rare bike and rare cover, and so I don't really want to just replace it with maybe one that's and the new old stocks of this early style are almost non-existent because Kawasaki mid-year made an update to this cover, and it's mainly how this is the opening for how the carburetor cables go down into the carburetor, and the later ones have some drill and tap holes to put a chrome trim piece that sandwiches the gasket, whereas the gasket just kind of sits in there and doesn't provide as good a seal as the later covers. So where we're trying to do as factory correct as possible on this bike, I want to save this cover if at all possible, and I think I can do it. So let's get started. Okay, I've cut off my piece that I think is going to be enough, and all you got to do is you sit here and you just knead it together, the black and the gray, until it becomes a uniform color. You don't see specks of gray or specks of black, and it should turn really like a dark gray once we get it properly mixed. If you don't get it properly mixed, this stuff will never cure. So it's like a 2-part epoxy. And there is a slight endothermic reaction. It will get a little warm on you. It's not going to burn you or anything. It does have a slight odor to it. And a lot of you saying, oh, shouldn't you have some gloves on? Well, I've tried gloves and this stuff just sticks to it. So I've never. You might want to be careful if you got real sensitive skin. I mean, maybe you might not be able to do this. But I had no trouble with the stuff. There's no warning label really that says not to do this, and this is how most people are going to do it. So, just about ready here. I really like this stuff. I mean, you should carry a stick with you because, I mean, you won't use it all that much, but and it doesn't go bad as long as you keep it all covered up. But it really works great. I've actually used it as for an emergency trail repair. And okay, I got plenty of it here, so I'm gonna rip a little of that off. And okay, I'm gonna use a little razor blade, kind of to just sort of form it. I mean, this is not exactly what this product is designed to do, but since we're going to be able to paint over this, I'm using it kind of as a filler. As long as I can get the rough shape, I'll be able to come back with some abrasive and kind of form it down. And with the high build primer, should be able to just hide this. It'll take a couple coats, and this stuff takes, I don't know, I forget what the directions say, but it's at least about an hour to fully cure. In about 20 minutes, it's pretty hard. But I'm going to wait probably 24 hours before I actually try to do anything with it. And of course, before I try to put any type of coating. But this is an experimental technique that I'm trying, and honestly, I'm not sure if it'll work, but really, well, it's still malleable. It's actually looking pretty good. I mean, it may not look like it on the camera because it's such a contrast from light and dark, but actually, it's working pretty well. I'm pretty happy with it. Alright, while we're letting our little aluminum patchwork, or aluminum body filler, however you want to look at that, cure and harden before I can go back and see if that's going to work for me, we're going to do a little painting on this. As I showed you before, I took a little 80 grit to just take out the rough spots and some of these minor gouges. And they really are. They're really just kind of minor. You can see them and you can feel them, but they're not deep. So we're going to just use a rattle can of this sandable high build primer. You can find this at most hardware stores, auto parts stores. And for small parts like this, it really makes sense. It's easier, more cost effective than even if you had a paint booth and a spray gun just to do these little parts. It's just easier to do this because we're gonna spray a couple coats, let it cure properly, and we're gonna sand it down, put another couple coats on, sand it down, and repeat until we get this completely smooth and you can't see these minor gouges. So let's get started. All right, well, our little aluminum patch fix slash Bondo, not really, but worked pretty good. Before it fully cured, I took my razor blade and I was able to scrape away the excess, and then once it fully cured, I was able to, starting with a little piece of 80 grit, take it down roughly to where it needs to be. Then I went to a little piece of 320. I happen to use silicon carbide on a film backing. These are just a sanding disc, old sanding discs I had laying around. So I just cut them up for some finger sanding and just took that down, kind of feathering the edges. Then I went to a 600 grit and did the same. And then finishing up with a 1500, took out all that, shined it up really good. Of course, you can see where my patch is because of the difference in color. But if you feel it, it feels just like the edge over here, which is perfect, and this is where that big old gouge was. So I'm pretty happy with it. It turned out really well. And after we throw some primer on here and clean up these scratches, and then put the finish coat on of the aluminum color, replicating the original finish, you're not even hardly going to know that was ever there. Okay, now that we got some of that taken care of, we're going to work a little bit on this skid plate. This is something that's going to be common, and we're going to have to do some more body work a little bit later on some of the fenders and such, and I'll get to that type of techniques. But this is going to be pretty easy. Brute force, use a hammer. It's what a ball peen hammer actually is for, is more for body work. That's what the rounded end kind of is for. But there are body tools. Use what you have around. Use a block of wood, and then, metal wants to kind of go back to its own shape, and, you can kind of tell how it needs to be. I can tell this, I can maybe even bend that with my hands. I'll probably put that in a vise and bend that, and I'm going to try to get this as close as possible. I might not be able to get it 100% perfect, but it's going to be on the bottom of the motorcycle, so you might not see it, but, it's just putting it on like this, it'll definitely show that, I didn't do anything with this. So all it takes is a lot of patience and different techniques. I'm going to start on a block of wood like this. I might have to move it like that. I might have to go down on concrete. Use different, just whatever you got around to try and get this hammered back into shape. And so we're going to make a lot of noise here. Well, we're back to this piece here, and I put a good coat of primer on there, not too heavy. We don't want any runs, because runs just mean you have to sand them out. It filled in a lot of those minor scratches. I can still see a couple of gouges here, which with first coat I didn't expect to cover those, because what I'm going to do is after this fully cures, it's not cured yet, I'm going to take some probably 120 grit and sand over the areas that I can feel have the low spots, sand them down. I'm going to hit it up with some more coats of primer, let that dry fully, then sand that down, and keep checking it. And I'm going to keep doing that process until I fill in all my little low spots, which there's just 1, 2, 3, 4, and a small 5 over there. So really 4 or 5 little places that I got to really work with. Otherwise, the rest of it covered up really good. And then after we get that all done, then we can put our finish coat on. Welcome back. We're nearing the home stretch. As you can see, I got some of the parts I've been working on laid out here. We've been refinishing a few things that you saw in the last episode. For example, this skid plate. You remember it was all real beat up and everything? Well, we put it all back into shape, smoothed it out, painted her up, and looks brand new. Also, you may have saw we did a little repair on our carburetor cover here, which actually fits right here. And if you remember, we had this big old gash and gouge in the aluminum, and you saw me fix that, and we put our final finish on it. It's a closest match to what the original finish. Like if I'd shine this up, it'd look close to this. And you're probably wondering, it's like, well, why didn't you do the clutch cover before you, put the engine back together? Well, if you remember, I like to get my engines running and get everything running before I get into any of the finishing part. And part of that was it's kind of a double-edged sword. I could have finished this before, put it together, got it all started, but as you can see over time, just even the factory coat, wears from your foot here, sitting on the foot peg and rubbing on the case, and little scratches just from hitting sticks and grass and things. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. I could have done that, but I would have risked chipping my new finish when I was getting it running, should I have needed to take it apart and do some other work. Fortunately, I didn't have to, but still, you're moving this kick lever around, and it can, if you're not careful, hit the case back here, and it's going to chip off, possibly. So I'm going to have to mask everything off and paint it while it's on the machine. It's a little harder to do it this way, but given the circumstances, this is the best alternative to doing it. Also, with this type of engine, the outer engine covers, like our ignition cover, and there's a clutch cover too that you need to get to. Carburetor cover and clutch cover are painted, as evidenced right here. And there was some wear on the carburetor cover right here where your boot would rub. But the center cases and the cylinder are just supposed to be left natural aluminum and not really even a high polish. Different bikes, have a different finish on them. Some of them, everything's polished, but this one, for a factory correct look, it just needs to be a kind of a matte looking natural aluminum. So what I'm going to do now, and that's why I have some other stuff laid out, is I'm going to show you what I'm going to have to do in this particular engine. Your project may be slightly different, but you can use the techniques used here. As you can see, we also have some other parts laid out here. They were in good enough shape. They were just a little bit dirty and shined up the chrome bolts and things. These are for the forks and top clamp. Also, the top clamp here, you may look and you may say, how come it's a matte black? Didn't you forget to put the clear on or use a gloss? No, the factory coat on the top clamp is actually a matte finish. So I have a good thick coat of matte and then of matte black, and also I put And on all of these I put a good 4 coats of a protective clear. Obviously on these covers and this I'll use a gloss, but this was a matte coat, and that's just for protection. This is similar to how the factory would have done it. Also have some little brackets here. These go to the frame. Frame is gloss, so we use gloss there. Interesting. The foot peg mounts here do not get painted. They stay a natural steel color. I'm going to use a product that will protect them from eventually rusting. I mean, these are a cast part, so they're actually an alloy. They're not exactly steel or cast iron. They're kind of in a cast aluminum, but there must be some steel in there because they did have a slight amount of rust. Also, we went and grabbed ourselves, there was some new old stock foot peg rubbers and replaced those. So the rubbers are going to look, rubber parts are going to look brand new. And here we are. We're ready to, get to polishing the cases, and then we're ready to, once the frame is completely done and dry, which I have it drying, we can put this back. We can start putting all these little detail parts, and of course there's more parts than just this. That just took a good sampling, shows you some of the different finishes that we have to do. Getting down to actual polishing, there's a couple of things you can do. I'm going to use buffing wheel, cotton buffing wheel. There's different ones you can get. They go on different types of tools. This is probably going to work for what I'm going to do. You can buy these kits at most tool stores, auto parts stores and things, and you can get them online anywhere. For the home shop, these are going to work just fine. There's what called buff bobs. They, maybe cone shape or ball shape. They'll be for getting into different areas. Also, you need some different compounds. There's jeweler's rouge, generally for gold, silver, and such. More finer finish. This is for more of a heavier cut. There's even heavier cuts than just these. Depends on how much corrosion you have. This aluminum is in pretty good shape. It's just a little bit of scale on it, so this will probably be good enough. Plus, I probably won't use this because I don't want a high gloss shine. I want more of a matte finish. Best I can tell from the factory brochures that are actually in color, because most things for this bike are in black and white, show painted, somewhat metallic aluminum color side cases with a matte finish on the raw aluminum. Also, there's this product out here. There's different metal polishes. This one's is from Eagle One. It's called Never Dull. It's just a wadding. You just rip off what you want, rub on there. This will be my last step to just kind of take off any residue from the buffing, and then this will also leave a good protective coating on there to keep the scale and oxidation from occurring too rapidly. Because this bike, as I said in the beginning, I'm really doing this to be as factory accurate as possible in the confines of a home shop. So, this is going to be more of a show bike for me. I'll ride it probably a little bit, but I'm not going to really put it through its paces. You've seen in the background I have 2 other bikes here, and that's going to be a future project that you'll see from me in the future, a future video series where I'm going to make one of these bikes and do some modifications to. And that's where using products like this will help keep something you're using every day in good looking order. So, all right. So to get to it here, it's pretty easy. Chuck up your buffing wheel. You're gonna, on a rotary tool, you're gonna rotate it and press some of the compound on there, and then just get to polishing and go into it. And with a lot of elbow grease and a lot of time, be patient with this process because it's going to take a while. It ain't going to just happen overnight. Well, here you go. After a couple hours of work, a lot of elbow grease and cramped fingers. As you can see, looks all nice and shiny, nice matte finish here. So we're ready to start taping this off and roughing this up so we can paint up this clutch cover, and then we're about ready to call this engine done and ready to start putting everything back in the frame. Well, alright. It's been a while since we've seen the frame here. I did a little bit of painting on this, and a little word about how I painted this. Now, I used an acrylic enamel, an automotive grade. That's because that's what would have came from the factory. Now, some people would say, why don't you just powder coat the frame? I could have done that. The thing is there's a lot of little accessory pieces that would be hard to, sometimes powder coating, you know, black isn't black all the way around. And when you got small pieces that you might want to just spray paint out of convenience, or it just maybe isn't practical to powder coat, you know, you can get a good finish, good hard finish, by doing proper prep and using the proper paints. And that's what I did here. And then I cleared it with a urethane clear, automotive grade, and put 4 coats on this thing. So it's got a real tough finish on here. And like I said, given this is just a show bike, you know, where your boot wears here, no little more than I'm going to ride it. You know, I'm not going to be riding it. It's not going to be a daily driver for me. This is going to wear just as long as the factory coat did. But as you can see, I got some of my parts here. We see the forks again here. And I'm about ready to put some of this stuff on. Now, you're probably wondering about the wheels. I still got to shine those up like I showed you doing the engine. Just a lot of elbow grease, and put some new tires on. And you'll see those back a little later. I have the swing arm done here. I just don't have it in the shot. But we're ready to really start putting some of this back together. We still got a few other little details to refinish as well. Probably going to need to replace some fasteners that are just kind of damaged. You know, I want this to look you know, brand new, so we're going to have to head to the hardware store and get, some of them are chrome, some of them are just natural, and we're going to replace all the engine case bolts and everything, which I haven't done yet, but that'll be one of the last steps. But I just wanted to show you, I've got the frame, I got the wiring harness put back in how it's supposed to be, cleaned up the wires, and I still got to put the battery box in, so then I can route the wires where they're exactly supposed to be, put the CDI box on, and then before I put the engine in, we're going to tape all these places in the frame, so when I'm manhandling the engine in, if I happen to bump it, I'm bumping the tape and not my frame risk chipping it. But I just painted this. It's only been a couple hours. I'm going to let this set for 24 to 48 hours before I actually start handling any more parts in here to make sure this clear is completely dry and completely hard. It's one thing people get in a rush. You know, I can touch it. It's not hurting it, but it's not completely cured or not completely hardened, and that's real important with a finish that you want to get a real hard finish on. But as you can see, looks real good, and we're, like I said again, we're nearing the home stretch. So keep watching. Welcome back. Well, we're a little bit farther on. We've put the forks back on, our triple clamps, got the headlight bucket on. Like I said, got the wiring through here. And next thing we're going to start tackling is getting them down to all the little details here. And one of the big things that'll be a problem for most people is the seat here. And this one, you know, it's stitching's coming apart here. The foam is rock hard and deteriorated, and actually it's coming out the bottom and making a mess. And so we're going to have to take the foam cover off, take the foam off, replace the foam, and I'm going to show you that a little bit later on. Also, another thing we got to do, here's the cage for the air filter. They don't sell a custom-made air filter for these anymore. So I bought some air filter media, just like what the pre-mades would be made out of. It's a sheet, and I'll have to measure and cut and then glue the end and make my own air filter that goes into the air box. So we got a lot of extra things to do. We got fasteners to go get. Ones that I could shine up and were reusable, I reused, but I got a bunch of different fasteners in a cup here that I need to go to the hardware store and get. So we got a lot of detail work, so let's get going. Well, cleaned up our seat pan here. We painted her all up with some rust block and primer. Looks pretty good. Had to straighten it out just a little bit, and good coat of primer on here. So we're ready to put some foam on here and rebuild the foam. Now, on vintage bikes like this, they're new seats, new seat foams, seat pans, and things are not readily available either in the aftermarket or even like on eBay as new old stock. I mean, I can't remember the last time I've seen a new old stock one come up on eBay for this bike or any other bike this old. So there's some companies out there that make reproduction seat covers, but it's the foam. That's assuming that your foam's any good, and any bike that's sit out in the weather, or the foam's going to be no good. Or even like this one, which as you saw in the first episode, we pulled it out of a barn literally, and the foam was still rock hard. I mean, the stuff's 40 years old. It can't be expected to stay soft forever. So next thing is we got to go and get some foam pieces and build our own seat foam. And I'm going to show you how to do that. What I have here is I got 2 pieces of foam, mainly to get the thickness that I need, but I have some closed cell dense foam used for automotive grade. You can buy it in squares like this. You can buy it in different quantities. Can sometimes be found at craft stores and hobby stores. Otherwise, upholstery shops will probably be able to sell it to you. Sometimes you may be able to get their remnants, because honestly, a motorcycle seat, you don't need all that much. So the other thing you're going to need is some spray adhesive that works on foam. Spray contact adhesive. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to put down our contact adhesive and start sticking these 2 pieces on here. I'll also want to note, a contact adhesive means you have to spray both sides of whatever you're trying to bond. Let them essentially dry, and then the bond happens when the 2 pieces contact, hence the name. Okay, after a little bit of dry time, we're ready to put these 2 together. Well, we have it all stuck. We'll let this cure, and we'll do the same thing to the thicker piece of foam. Put a layer of glue on this side and a layer of glue on the other piece of foam, and then we'll stick it down on top. Well, there you go. Really, just about 10 minutes worth of work. We have our foam all glued up, ready to go. But I can hear you out there. You're going to say, well, now what do you do? I mean, I can't cover this. Well, I'm going to show you a neat and trick way to cut and shape this foam, because that's what we're going to have to do, is trim it and then shape it into the factory shape before we can put a cover on this. Okay, we let our pieces of foam and adhesive dry to our seat pan, and now it's time to cut off the excess. Now there's a few different ways you can do this, of course. One is with, grab yourself a real sharp knife. Bread knife works real good. Some guys can use an electric knife, works kind of good. But any sharp knife to cut. Now what you're going to do is you're going to follow the edge and perimeter of the seat and try to make a perpendicular cut so you have a square piece when you're done, the shape of the seat pan. Well, as you can see, we have our seat all rough cut out. I left quite a bit of excess because we need to shape this down to the original shape. Now, this is pretty brittle because this is the original seat foam. You saw me take that off earlier. It's pretty hard, rotten, and falling apart. So what I want to do is, I want to have it here for a guide, but I also want to take a few measurements, and I can then put some reference lines on here so I know how much to take off. And how I'm going to do that, you can use the knife to take off the big chunks, but what I've found works great. Angle grinder with about an 80 or a 60 grit flap disc or a fiber disc will work. Any type of sanding disc, and you can use this with a good hand to shape the foam. Now, that goes without saying. You want to use some safety glasses, some eye protection, and also at least a cheap dust mask, because you're going to have all this foam. It's going to make a lot of mess. So you want to do it somewhere where it's easy to clean up, because you're going to create a lot of dust when you do this. Well, as you can see, it's a messy job here, and I got the shape roughed out here using my grinder and sanding wheel. Next thing is just to put the cover on, and when we do that, we might want to, adjust the shape a little bit, because this is just an approximation. I still left quite a bit of material on here just in case I should need to shave a little bit more off, but that's it. That's basically how you make make a seat foam for a pan, and takes a little bit of time. It's a little bit messy, but it's definitely a do-it-yourself job. Plus, it's fairly forgiving, because let's say I screwed up and I took too much off. I could always shave it down, put another piece of foam on to build it up to the height, and do it again. Well, until next time, I'm the Junk Man, and thanks for watching. Welcome back. As you can see, we've progressed a lot farther. We've put the engine back in, we got the exhaust on, a lot of little extra doodads, foot pegs, and things. Still got to source and either clean up or just replace some different fasteners, some minor fasteners here and there. A few of them that I left in for when I painted it, just so I wouldn't have to, fill the threads full of paint and primer and clean them out later. However, I'm still going through. That's why I got my tap and dyes here, going through and just cleaning up the threads in anything that might need it, just so everything goes back together real nice and easy. And if you remember, last time I showed you how to rebuild the seat foam on the seat pan. Now I had a pan and it was in good enough shape. It was a little bent, but I put it back in shape, and I got her finished. I got a cover on it that I actually made. I'll show that in an entirely different video, because that's not really a do-it-yourselfer project, making a seat cover. Because doing this making this piping and cutting out the pattern, and then of course just getting it sewed back together requires a special sewing machine, upholstery machine with heavy-duty needles, a pretty high horsepower electric motor to actually go through, because in some of these places you're going through 3, 4, and 5 different layers of material that just, a regular dressmaking machine isn't going to do, even if you would happen to have that laying around. But most garage do-it-yourselfers are not going to have the ability to do this. So if there's a reproduction cover out there for you, I would suggest going that route. And if there isn't, this is one place. Take it to an upholstery shop. They can do all this work for you. You can save a little money doing your own seat foam, but you know what? They may do all that for you. I also made a stencil and put the Kawasaki on the back here using the correct font and using a paint design for vinyl. It's made by Duplicolor. You can go out to the internet and find that. It's actually designed for this. So I got the seat all done, and it's basically ready to go on. I got to get the hinges, but it'll fit on somewhere like that, and look pretty good. So we're just down to the fenders and the tank and putting the paint on that, doing some graphic work. I still have to kind of do some tweaking to our fuel system here. I've showed these before. This bike, I maybe didn't talk too much about it, but this has one of those vacuum shutoff deals, and some newer carbureted bikes still have these, and I showed how to replace that. And for this one, because I want it to look right, I'm going to refinish this, probably do some soda blasting on this to get rid of some of the scale on this here, and replace it. But like if I was going to make this like kind of an everyday rider or something that I want to be real reliable, because this is unreliable, I would probably source one that could screw in here, doesn't have the vacuum port, cap off the vacuum port on the carburetor, and just run it as regular, and convert it over. And that's probably what I'll do on these other 2 projects that you may see later on in the future when I get to those. And so anyway, that's a few little things that I got left to do, but otherwise this is probably going to be the last video, and then before I reveal the actual finished bike with fenders, tank, and everything. So what I'm going to do here is just finish putting in some of my fasteners and replacing my fasteners, and then I'm going to clean up and sand down the tank and sand down the fenders to get ready to do the graphics. Well, we got the bike off the lift, and we got all our body work up here. I just want to show you what I'm going to be working on next, because this is basically the last stage. Start here with the tank. I've already cleaned it out and put a tank liner in there, and I'm not going to show you how to do that because there's a bunch of different techniques to do. You can go out on the internet and find that. Different products to do this. I've even heard of some homebrew applications, like filling it up with apple cider vinegar or something to that effect, and I've heard that works great. I filled mine up with Evaporust because I have it laying around the shop. I have like 5 gallons of this stuff because I use it for other projects, not just for this. Same thing here. We got the oil tank, which is in good shape internally because it was sealed and there was actually oil in it, so all it was basically drain it out and flush it out real good. I still need to clean it up real good. Front fender here, it's a little worse for wear, which is pretty darn common on these bikes or any off-road bike with the aluminum fenders. They crack and things. Obviously, if I was a aluminum welder and was really good at it, I could probably try and fix this. If I had no other choice, I would take this somewhere and have them, fix it up and get it back in shape and fix the cracks and then grind them down. But fortunately, I was able to find, pretty inexpensively actually, considering how rare the aluminum fenders are for this bike, a almost perfect one that somebody's obviously painted green here. Either it came off of a F81M, or it doesn't look like it because this looks like it's kind of a home paint job. So I'll strip this down, and this will be my new front fender. Got that, picked that up pretty cheaply. Same with the rear fender. It's in good shape, just needs a little bit of TLC here and there, but there's no cracks in it, and it just, you know, paint's chipping, which is normal. The thing is, it kind of defeats the purpose of having an aluminum fender, is it does have this steel inner structure to give it the strength and also to carry the load of the tail light. But you know, on the later bikes of these, they just went away from the all aluminum and went to steel, mostly probably out of durability. Next thing you're going to need is obviously a digital camera. You want to take pictures of all, especially if yours are in pretty good shape like mine. Take pictures so for reference, for like where the stripes go and things, and maybe put a scale next to it so you can have a measurement. And also you want to take notes, maybe take measurements of where these line up. Depending on how you're going to redo this, I'm going to have to mask these off and reproduce these using a kit from Reproduction Decals, and I want to give them a little plug just because they have a lot of different kits and decals and all the little stickers. Like they have a warning decal about, you know, what two-stroke oil they use that's factory on this oil tank and things. They have this decal here, because this is a decal. I can feel it there. So, you know, go there if you're doing any vintage stuff. They got quite a bit there. Also, they got some hard parts as well. But I'm not going to show too detailed on what I'm actually going to do, because every restoration is different depending on the type of paint job you're going. Are you going custom? Are you going original? Are you kind of doing a mix of both? And some tanks and fenders and things, the original is a graphic, and so that's applied a little bit differently. So just follow the instructions with whatever graphics or technique that you choose to do. But the basics are all going to be here. We got to strip these, sand it all down, put a good coat of primer on there, good automotive grade primer, and then whatever top color top coat. I'm going to have to get this matched best I can to the original color here. Shoot it, and then we're ready to put it on and for you to see the final product. Well, as you can see, I have a lot of work ahead of me here of sanding and priming and painting and masking of all the graphics here. So the next time you see this bike, all this stuff should be ready to be put on the bike, and we'll be completely done. So we got one more episode left. So like my Facebook page, check out my website, and thanks for watching. Well, that was fun now, wasn't it? That's actually the last year of the Bighorn, the redesigned F9, which I have two examples of. I want to stop and take a minute to answer a question that I've been getting. Why the Kawasaki Bighorn, and why the 1970 model year? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to before I was born. 1970 to be exact, when my dad picked up this brochure from G&W Sports Center in Denver, Colorado, where he would have seen his first F5 Bighorn. The Bighorn was a bike that always caught his attention, and if you have seen episode 2, you will understand why. The Bighorn had a lot to offer in 1970. My dad would go on to own several other bikes throughout the years, but never a Bighorn. However, in 1998, he would be able to own one of the bikes he has always wanted to own, however not in the showroom condition that he deserves. I remember that day pretty well. We were on a trip back from Denver. stopping along the way in McCook, Nebraska at a small independent dealership, Lewis Motorsports, just to look around in their back lot of junk motorcycles. But inside was hiding this 1970 F5 Bighorn among other bikes. Well, a bit of haggling later, the Bighorn and some triples followed us home on the trailer that always seemed to follow us wherever we went. So for a mere $50, he now owned one of his dream bikes. It did need some work, however, but with a full-time job farming and 2 kids heading off to college, a vintage bike restoration was not high on the priority list. This brings us to the present and why I chose this particular restoration. I wanted to fix up one of my dad's dream bikes so he could see it in the showroom condition like he remembered seeing it back in 1970. So if you've not figured it out by now, this is my way of saying thank you to the person that taught me everything I know. Thanks, Dad. First, we started off extracting the bike from its home inside a barn. Next, we moved on to some disassembly of the engine. We did some preliminary checks and measurements to determine what parts we might need and got the parts on order. During that time, we cleaned up some of the parts, getting the engine ready for reassembly with the new parts. We then installed the new parts in preparation to get the engine running. We got the engine running and did some minor tuning. Then it was on to stripping the frame of all its accessories to be either replaced, rebuilt, or refinished. After it was finally time to start putting it back together into a rolling chassis and then installing the engine back into the frame one more time. After finishing the paint and graphics, here is the finished bike. Well now, for the moment you've all been waiting for, the reveal. Well, here it is. We got everything done. We got the fenders on, got the tank on, got the oil tank on, all the graphics and paint done, seat, all the little details. And I must say, it looks pretty good. I impressed myself even. I want to sit down now and let's take a look at some of the literature that I have for this bike, because I have quite a bit for it. You saw me in a couple episodes refer to my service manual. You know, I have the factory service manual from 1970. I mean, of course, they made revisions for this for every year the bike was available, but this has, you know, everything about the 1970 models. So, I mean, this is kind of a rare piece. It even has the factory dealer sticker with the part number, and actually it has also the inventory label, so it tells the location in American Kawasaki's warehouse where this was located when a dealer would order this up for a customer. So that's pretty cool. You've seen me use that. Also, what else I have here, and this is also kind of a rarity. This is the manual for the F5 Speed Kit, which was offered only in 1970. Now the parts will fit other years, but the parts were only available at dealers in 70 and probably into 71, but it wasn't something that really took off with Kawasaki. Again, has the original little inventory label there, shows where the bin was, and in the, you know, even the PO number for whatever dealer ordered this back in the day. And this is really cool. It has a bunch of specs, all the part numbers for all the optional parts. For example, there's the which was stock on the carburetor cover is an intake. It has part number for the aftermarket expansion chamber. It has there was aftermarket, well, not aftermarket, I mean they were Kawasaki, but different shocks that supposedly were better, a different carburetor, also a different piston, a 2-ring piston that was a lot lighter, different rotary disc valve with different specs. However, it has all the specs it actually has the specs in here for the exhaust expansion chamber. So if you were good with metal, you could actually replicate this, and I think that's pretty cool. There's also, it has specifications for the updated crankshaft for this bike, because this is a low engine number, early engine number, a low engine number. Engine numbers after, I think it says, yeah, 07268, came with a larger diameter crank bearing for reliability, and the later cranks fit the older engines, but this has the earlier one in it because it's an early engine. It also has the specs so you could cut your factory rotary disc valve, basically for more intake duration. It has all those specs. Also the porting, it has the port specs, so it tells you how to open them up and how wide and tall and all that, so you can report your own cylinder. It's just a really neat manual. A lot of this information that I could find isn't really out there on the internet. I mean, some is, but it's like scattered all over the internet. Here it is, all in one spot. This is a pretty cool, pretty rare manual. Probably most people have never even heard of this, even if they are kind of bighorn aficionados. They know about the speed kit, but they probably didn't know that there was actually a manual for it, and I have it. The other thing is, and you saw this earlier in the video, I have a brochure from the factory, or well, from the dealer that you pick up. I mean, just like today, this was from G&W Sports Center. My dad picked this up in 1970, held it all these years, and it's real because it's got the dealer stamp on there. Just kind of unique. I'll probably go into detail in these type of things in a different video because there's a lot to cover here. It just tells you all the unique things about this bike. The forks, the engine, as far as how much power. And actually, it's kind of unique. A lot of these pictures in here are from actually the early prototype that was in 1979. Actually, this picture on here is from the prototype because if you actually look at the tank graphics, they don't actually match the production bikes or even the graphics that are featured on the other side here, because the tank graphics were actually from the earlier bikes, probably from like the F21M and things. So that's kind of unique, only if you're really looking. And the other thing I thought was kind of funny is even here on the oil tank, they're showing the engine, they're highlighting the engine, talking about how great the engine is, but the oil tank doesn't say Bighorn 350 on it. So, and the carburetor cover is radically different than the production bikes. So that's kind of a unique thing there. So that's also neat to have. That's an original piece there. Also, I have tons of the magazine. I mean, this is Cycle World, January 1970. I doubt that there's another publication earlier than this that has any information on the Bighorn. So this is probably the very first time that anybody, if they subscribe to motorcycle magazines, would have read about the Bighorn. And you can see it on the cover there. Looks just like mine here, pretty much. The sensational Kawasaki Bighorn. And of course, back in the day, magazines, only the cover and only covers were in color. So, there's no color pictures in here. But it has it's an interesting test. I mean, overall, they liked the bike. There was a few things they pointed out could have been improved, or had the bike been broken in before they got it. They talked about the shifting and the clutch was a little grabby, little things like that. And that that was common to other bikes. But anyway, there it is. I mean, I'm going to go into detail on this later into some of the magazine articles, but there's one there. Okay, and here's probably the next publication that people probably would have read it in is Cycle Magazine, June 1970, and the articles, has the similar complaints and conclusion as Cycle World. Overall, they liked the bike. Overall, they thought this was a pretty good bike, pretty ambitious for the time. Had a lot of features, had a lot of power and everything. It was just some of the small refinements that they thought could have been a little bit better. They call it the Hata Kawasaki, so much so soon, and that's I kind of like that tagline because on paper there's a lot on this bike that previous bikes it's suspension as long as he went up and down, that was good enough, kind of thing. As long as the engine ran, that was good enough. So, but what's funny about, and of course this is the only color picture in this magazine as well. Funny, Cycle didn't take this picture. This is another photograph that Kawasaki must have submitted because it's the same rider, same terrain in the background is what's in this dealer brochure. It's just a different, he's just in a different position or riding stance because it even has the incorrect pre-production gas tank graphics versus what came on the production bike. And even when you look in there and you look at the graphics of the one they actually tested, it has the same type of graphics. And what I'm talking about here, and I'll get a close-up on this, is the graphic up front here is rounded. It's not this kind of more squared and rectangular or trapezoidal. Look, it's more rounded, reminiscent of the earlier bikes like the F21M or the Sidewinder, for example, had this type of graphic. I think that's kind of neat. Probably something that most people wouldn't pick up on if they didn't have the brochure to kind of compare by. But the guy's pants are the same, helmet's the same, shirt's the same. It's the same guy. Kawasaki just submitted that to the magazine. The magazine didn't even take that as a picture. Later on, we had, well, I guess I was incorrect. Cycle Guide was 1 month earlier, May of '70, and incidentally, this one has the Avenger on the front, which I have a 1968 version of that bike. Maybe I'll show that bike sometime. But it also does the F5 too, big horn in here, and of course their pictures have the correct graphics, correct tank, everything. They go through, they say a lot of the same things. They were pretty impressed by it. Thought it had a lot of features for the time, unique in that fact. They thought, of course, it needed some refinement in some areas, just as all the other magazines said, and I would agree with a lot of their complaints. I would kind of agree. Things like the controls and things were made of kind of a cheap aluminum and they broke easily. As a matter of fact, that was probably the most expensive part I had to source for this thing, was this throttle housing, because every single one that I could find in a junkyard or anything was broke just like mine because the crappy metal that they used. But real interesting, has all the specs and everything, and a lot of nice pictures here that I could compare just for posterity there. That was pretty neat. And then I do have another issue of Cycle. This would be September of '71. So, and this is the F5A would have been. They call it the quick fixed bighorn, because the F5A fixed some of the little minor detail things that the earlier bike like this one kind of had. I want to say kind of this bike was maybe a little rushed in a ways. And anyways, they go through and talk about the things that were fixed, and they came away really liking the bike. The minor shifting issues and things, they Kawasaki kind of got sorted out, and tolerances tightened up, and so they really liked it in this one. And actually, this is the magazine where they actually entered this in to the Greenhorn Enduro Pasadena Motorcycle Club's 25th anniversary in 1971. Greenhorn Enduro, which is what is or was a pretty notorious race. And they had 4 of these entered in. Team Kawasaki had them in there, and a Cycle World staff member who remains nameless in this article rode it, and rode within about 100 miles, and then he broke his toe on a rock, and a substitute rider finished with the bike, and they had no, basically they were telling you they went through this 500-mile race on a largely untested bike, or well, a quick fix bike, but still kind of a first year, more like a first year bike, and it finished a 500-mile enduro. They did no modifications other than I think they just took the lights off and things like that. But otherwise, it was completely stock bike, and so I think that's a pretty good testament to how this bike fared for the day. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't the hottest bike there at that race, but the fact that it was able to finish when most bikes wouldn't finish or broke down, and it's all outlined in the article, I think is pretty impressive. So, well, that's going to wrap it up for this episode and this whole series. I really hoped you enjoyed this. I hope you were able to learn something that you could apply to your restoration, or if you're someone who has never attempted a restoration, it shows you maybe a little bit of everything that's involved with a restoration to do in your garage. And then I'm hoping that it gives you the tools and the knowledge to evaluate if it's something you want to tackle. So that's the end of this series. That's the end of this episode. I had a lot of fun. I hope you guys had a lot of fun watching me do this. And I don't know what I'm going to do next, but keep watching my website, like my Facebook page, because that's where I post all my updates. My Twitter feed too. I'm not as active on there, but watch my Facebook page, check my website, because I'm always coming out with different videos, other how-to videos to help people like you. I mean, I'm aiming these videos at people that just have a little bit of mechanical knowledge. They just need the confidence, and I'm hoping that I can give that back, because I've gotten that from a lot of other users, learned how to do things from watching videos from you guys out there. So that's all for this restoration. I'm sure you'll see more of this bike in the future. So like I said, like my Facebook page and keep up on the website. And thanks for watching.